I never imagined my journey to better health would turn into a full-blown soap opera. But here we are. It started innocently enough. A routine doctor's visit where I was given the dreaded talk. "Mr. Evans," the doctor said with that calm, detached tone they all seem to master. "Your tests show you're at risk for diabetes, gout, and hypertension. The trifecta of doom." I sat there, stunned, and nodded like a bobblehead as he listed diet plans and exercise regimens. I wasn't going to wait until it was too late. That evening, I told Jane, my wife of 11 years, about the wake-up call. Her reaction surprised me. She didn't just agree we should work on our health. She was excited about it. "It'll be fun," she said, flashing her warm, encouraging smile. That smile had gotten me through my worst days, and now it was my turn to do better for her. We decided to join the gym together, figuring it was a way to stay motivated. The first week was rough. I was sore in places I didn't even know I had muscles. Jane, on the other hand, took to it like a duck to water. She seemed to thrive in that environment, pushing herself on the treadmill, trying new machines, and even chatting with the staff. I was proud of her. She was always beautiful to me. But as the weeks went by, I saw her confidence grow alongside her fitness. Now, let me introduce you to the star of the show, or at least the guy who thought he was. Enter our gym's resident Adonis, the trainer I jokingly dubbed Mr. Biceps. This man didn't just walk into a room. He strutted like a peacock during mating season. He was everything you'd expect from a gym trainer in his prime. Tanned, shredded, and somehow always glistening like he'd just stepped off the set of a sports drink commercial. He had a habit of demonstrating exercises for female gym-goers, his hands lingering just long enough to make you question his professionalism. At first, Jane and I would laugh about him. "Look at Mr. Biceps," I'd say, pointing at him flexing his way through a set of pull-ups. Jane would giggle and roll her eyes. But over time, I started noticing something I couldn't quite shake. One day, as we were on the ellipticals, he took off his shirt to wipe his face. A move clearly meant to showcase his abs. I turned to Jane, expecting her usual amused eye roll, but instead, I caught her staring. Not just a passing glance, mind you, a full-on, wide-eyed gaze. Then, she licked her lips. It felt like someone had dumped a bucket of cold water over me. I laughed it off at the moment, but the image burned itself into my brain. On the drive home, I tried to bring it up casually. "Did you see Mr. Biceps showing off again?" I asked, glancing over to gauge her reaction. She shrugged, looking out the window. "Not really," she said. "I was probably just lost in thought." Lost in thought? Was I imagining things? I decided to let it go. After all, I trusted Jane. She was the love of my life, and we had a strong bond, one I thought was unshakable. But over the next few weeks, I couldn't help but notice the little things. She'd spend more time chatting with Mr. Biceps after her workouts, laughing at something he said, or letting him correct her form during exercises. I told myself it was harmless. She was just being friendly. Then came the day that changed everything. Jane was at the Smith machine doing squats. I was across the gym, wiping down a treadmill, when I saw him approach her. My chest tightened as he put his hands on her waist, supposedly to help guide her form. The way his fingers lingered there, it wasn't right. I felt a surge of anger I couldn't control. Marching over, I said, "I've got it from here," in a tone that left no room for argument. He backed off, his trademark smirk firmly in place. "No problem, buddy," he said, raising his hands as if to surrender. Buddy. He called everyone buddy. But in that moment, it felt like he was mocking me. Jane looked embarrassed. "My God, Mark," she hissed as we left the gym. That night, the tension boiled over. I told her I didn't like how Mr. Biceps was acting around her. She accused me of being jealous and insecure. "He's just doing his job," she snapped. "What am I supposed to do? Be rude to him?" I countered that she could set boundaries without being rude, but the argument spiraled. By the end of it, we were both exhausted and agreed to switch gyms just to put the issue behind us. At the time, I thought that would be the end of it. I had no idea this was only the beginning of a story that would unravel my entire world. Switching gyms seemed like the logical step. It was a fresh start, right? A chance to leave behind the tension and awkwardness that Mr. Biceps had introduced into our lives. Jane and I signed up at a smaller, less flashy gym closer to home. It didn't have all the bells and whistles, no sauna, no juice bar, and thankfully no showboating trainers, but it had everything we needed. I felt a glimmer of hope that we could move past this. First, things improved. We fell into a new rhythm, working out together in the mornings before heading off to work. I'd spot her during weightlifting sessions, and she'd cheer me on during my runs on the treadmill. It reminded me of why we started this journey in the first place, to support each other, to grow stronger together. I told myself the rough patch we hit was just that. A patch, nothing more. But over time, I noticed something shifting in Jane. It started with small things. She'd finish her workouts earlier than me and wait by the car instead of hanging around to stretch or chat. Her responses to my texts during the day became shorter, more matter-of-fact. "How's your day?" would get a "fine." "Miss you" would get a "you too." It wasn't like her. Jane was the type to write back paragraphs, emojis and all. Then came the resentment. It bubbled to the surface one evening after a workout. I had mentioned offhandedly how much better the new gym was compared to the old one. "At least here we don't have trainers crossing boundaries," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Jane froze, mid-bite of her post-workout protein bar, and shot me a glare that could melt steel. "Are you ever going to let that go, Mark?" she snapped. "You made me give up a gym I loved because of your insecurities. Do you realize how controlling that makes you sound?" I was stunned. Controlling? Me? I stammered out a defense, saying it wasn't about control but about respect and boundaries. She rolled her eyes. "Boundaries, Mark?" He was doing his job. "You're the one who made it weird." That night, she went to bed early, leaving me sitting alone in the living room, replaying the argument in my head. Was I really the bad guy here? Had I overreacted? I wanted to believe we could work through this, but a gnawing feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. A few weeks later, a new opportunity came up at work, an afternoon shift with better pay. Jane and I discussed it over dinner. "It means I'll have to switch to morning gym sessions," I explained. "We'd be on different schedules, but it's only temporary." She nodded a little too quickly, I thought. "That's fine," she said, barely looking up from her plate. "I'll keep going in the afternoons. It's when I feel most energetic anyway." I wanted to suggest she switch to mornings with me, but I stopped myself. She was still prickly from our last argument, and I didn't want to poke the bear. Maybe a little space would be good for us. For the next few months, we hardly saw each other at the gym. I'd be there bright and early, surrounded by the usual morning crowd, mostly retirees and young professionals. Jane, meanwhile, stuck to her afternoon routine. She'd tell me about her workouts in passing. "Leg day was killer," or "I finally hit my squat goal." It all sounded normal. Too normal. But something else changed during this period. Jane started pulling away in ways that weren't as easy to brush off. She stopped texting me during the day. When I'd ask how her day was, her answers became vague. Busy was her favorite response. And when I tried to plan date nights or even just an evening walk, she always seemed too tired or distracted. One evening, I decided to surprise her at the gym. I had finished work early and thought it'd be fun to join her for a session like old times. I walked in and scanned the room, expecting to see her at her usual spot near the free weights. But she wasn't there. Maybe she's on the treadmill, I thought, weaving through the rows of machines. Still no sign of her. My stomach tightened. I checked the parking lot. Her car was there. Confused, I asked the front desk if they'd seen her. "Oh, Jane? Yeah, she was here earlier but left about 20 minutes ago," the receptionist said. 20 minutes ago? That didn't make sense. I texted her, "Hey, are you still at the gym?" No reply. I drove home, half expecting to see her car in the driveway, but it wasn't there. An hour later, she walked through the door, still in her workout clothes, but something was off. Her hair was too neat, her makeup untouched. Hardly what you'd expect after an intense workout. "Hey," I said cautiously, "where have you been? I stopped by the gym to surprise you, But you'd already left. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. Oh, support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. I ran into a coworker after my workout, and we grabbed a coffee. It sounded plausible, but her tone didn't sit right with me. There was a tightness to it, like she'd rehearsed the line. I wanted to push for more details, but something stopped me. Instead, I just nodded and said, "Okay." That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the growing puzzle in my head. The following weeks felt like walking on eggshells. I tried to push the doubts out of my mind, convincing myself that I was just overthinking things. But the little inconsistencies in Jane's behavior kept piling up. She'd mention things that didn't quite add up, like running errands that seemed to take hours or having work meetings at times when her office would typically be closed. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the result of a hectic schedule and my imagination running wild. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. One Friday evening, I decided to plan a surprise date night. It had been too long since we'd done something just for us, and I hoped it would bring us closer. I texted Jane during the day, "Clear your evening. I've got a surprise planned." Her reply came an hour later. "Can't tonight. Busy. Maybe tomorrow." Busy? On a Friday night? That was unusual. She wasn't the kind of person to overwork herself, and her idea of unwinding typically involved Netflix and takeout. But I let it go, replying with a casual, "Okay. Tomorrow then." The next day, she seemed more distant than usual. She stayed in bed longer, scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging me. When I asked if she was feeling okay, she shrugged. "Just tired. Long week." I decided to give her space, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was weighing on her. That afternoon, while she was in the shower, I noticed her gym bag by the door. It wasn't unusual for it to be there, but something about it caught my eye. The zipper wasn't fully closed, and her phone was resting on top. I don't know what possessed me, but I picked it up. My hands were trembling as I debated whether to unlock it. I knew her passcode, we'd always been open about that, but snooping felt like crossing a line. Still, the doubts gnawed at me. Before I could decide, the shower turned off. Panicking, I put the phone back exactly as I'd found it and stepped away, my heart pounding. When she came out, I pretended to be engrossed in a book, though I barely registered the words. That evening, I suggested we go for a walk. It was a cool, crisp night, and I thought maybe some fresh air would loosen the tension between us. She agreed reluctantly, slipping on her jacket and barely speaking as we strolled through the neighborhood. "Jane," I started cautiously, "is everything okay? You've seemed off lately." She stopped walking and sighed, rubbing her temples. "Mark, I'm fine. Just stressed. Work has been overwhelming, and honestly, I think you're reading too much into things." Her response stung, but I nodded, not wanting to push her further. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing gap between us. A week later, I decided to drop by her gym during her usual workout time. I told myself it wasn't about spying. I just wanted to surprise her. Maybe we could grab dinner afterward and reconnect. When I walked in, the place was bustling, but Jane wasn't there. I waited for a few minutes, glancing around at the familiar faces, but she never showed up. Confused, I asked the receptionist if she'd checked in. "Jane Evans?" "No, I haven't seen her today," they said. My stomach sank. I left the gym, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe she'd changed her schedule, or maybe she wasn't feeling well. But when I got home, her car wasn't in the driveway. She returned later that evening, her energy oddly upbeat. "Sorry I missed the gym," she said breezily, setting her keys on the counter. "I ended up working late and didn't feel like going after." It sounded plausible, but her gym bag, slung over her shoulder, looked untouched. No used towel, no water bottle. Everything was neatly packed, as if it hadn't been opened all day. "That's okay," I said, forcing a smile. "I stopped by earlier to surprise you, but I guess we just missed each other." She froze for a split second, then laughed nervously. "Oh, you did? That's sweet of you. Sorry I wasn't there." I nodded, pretending to accept her explanation, but the unease in my chest grew heavier. Over the next few days, I kept myself busy, trying not to dwell on it. I threw myself into work, hoping the distraction would help. But every time I saw Jane scrolling on her phone or leaving the house without much explanation, that gnawing doubt resurfaced. One evening, I suggested we have a movie night, a simple way to spend time together and maybe break through the wall that seemed to be building between us. She agreed, but halfway through the movie, she got up to grab her phone and didn't come back. When I found her in the kitchen, she was typing furiously, her face illuminated by the screen. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She jumped, locking her phone and shoving it into her pocket. "Yeah, fine. Just a work thing." "On a Saturday night?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She sighed. "Mark, can you not? I don't need the third degree every time I check my phone." Her tone shut me down, and I returned to the couch alone. That night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something wasn't right. But what? I don't know if it was the guilt from the constant suspicions gnawing at me or the sheer exhaustion from the tension between us, but I decided I needed to change my approach. Instead of obsessing over Jane's every move, I resolved to focus on us, on rebuilding the connection that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I made an effort to really talk. Not about work or errands or any of the mundane things that had taken over our conversations lately, but about us. "Jane," I started, setting my fork down. "I feel like we've been off lately. And I don't mean just you. I know I've been distant, too. I don't want us to lose what we have." She looked up from her plate, her expression softening. For the first time in weeks, it felt like I had her attention. "I know," she admitted quietly. "Things have been weird. I guess I've just been feeling a little overwhelmed, and I didn't know how to say it without making things worse." I reached across the table, taking her hand. "You can tell me anything, Jane. I mean that. I want to be here for you." Her eyes glistened as she gave my hand a small squeeze. "I've been feeling like I've let you down, Mark. You've always been so supportive, and I feel like I've been shutting you out." Hearing her say that cracked something open in me. Maybe I wasn't imagining everything after all. Maybe this was just the stress and drift that can creep into any long-term relationship. "We've both been shutting each other out," I said. "Let's change that." The next day, I decided to surprise her with a gesture I knew she'd appreciate. Jane loved little getaways, even if it was just for a night. So, I booked us a cozy cabin about an hour's drive from the city. It wasn't fancy, but it had a fireplace and a great view of the lake. A perfect spot for a reset. When I told her about it, her face lit up. "Really?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of surprise and excitement. "Really?" I said, smiling. "Just us. No distractions." She hugged me tightly, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were on the same page again. The trip turned out to be exactly what we needed. We spent the evening wrapped in blankets by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. She laughed at my silly stories, and I listened as she opened up about the pressure she'd been feeling at work. "It's like I'm always trying to prove myself," she confessed, staring into the flames. "Even to myself." "You don't have to prove anything to me," I said gently. "You're amazing, Jane. You always have been." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight of our tension start to lift. When we got back home, things seemed better. Jane was more present, more affectionate. She started leaving little notes for me in my lunch bag, sweet reminders of how much she cared. I made an effort to plan more dates and find ways to make her smile, whether it was bringing home her favorite dessert or surprising her with flowers. Even our conversations became lighter. We joked around like we used to, and she started sharing stories about her day again, instead of the one-word answers that had become her default. One evening, while we were watching a movie, she turned to me and said, "I really needed that trip, Mark. Thank you for not giving up on me." "Never," I replied, kissing her forehead. For a while, it felt like we were finding our way back to each other. The doubts and suspicions faded into the background, replaced by the quiet hope that maybe we were stronger than the challenges we'd been facing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that there was something still lingering. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Something just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface. For a while, it felt like we had turned a corner. Jane and I were finally finding our rhythm again. The laughter had returned, the little touches, the inside jokes that only we shared. Even our mornings felt lighter. We'd sit at the breakfast table, her sipping her coffee, me scarfing down toast, and we'd talk. Not about to-do lists or work, but about things that mattered to us. "I was thinking," she said one morning, a small smile playing on her lips. "We haven't gone hiking in ages. Remember that trail we loved near the falls?" I grinned. "The one where we got caught in the rain and ended up drenched and covered in mud?" "Exactly," she laughed, her eyes crinkling in that way I'd always loved. "We should go back. Relive the chaos." "Deal," I said, pulling out my phone to check the weather for the weekend. Felt good, planning something fun together again like old times. The rest of that week, our momentum continued. Jane seemed more relaxed, more engaged. She even suggested a game night, something we hadn't done in years. Sitting cross-legged on the floor of our living room, surrounded by cards and dice, we were like kids again. "Your turn," she teased, tapping the game board. "If you land on my hotel, I swear I'll bankrupt you." "Oh, you think you're so tough?" I shot back, rolling the dice. Of course, I landed on her property, and she let out a triumphant cheer, throwing her arms in the air. Moments like that reminded me why I fell in love with her in the first place. It wasn't just her smile or her wit. It was the way she could make the simplest things feel special. But as much as things improved at home, there was still one thing that nagged at me. Jane's long hours at work. "I swear, I'm going to start charging my boss overtime for all these late nights," she joked one evening as she walked through the door. "Rough day?" I asked, handing her a glass of water. "Rough week," she sighed, kicking off her heels and sinking into the couch. "It's just this project. It feels like it'll never end. Meetings, emails, revisions. I can't keep up." I sat down beside her, rubbing her shoulders lightly. "You're incredible, you know that? They're lucky to have you." She leaned into my touch, closing her eyes. "Thanks, Mark. I really needed that." It became a pattern. Jane would come home late, looking drained, and I'd do my best to cheer her up. I'd have dinner waiting, or her favorite playlist playing softly in the background. One night, I even set up a bubble bath for her, complete with candles and a glass of wine. "You're spoiling me," she said, smiling as she sank into the warm water. "You deserve it," I replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Despite the late nights, Jane always made an effort to reassure me. She'd text during the day, little messages like, "Thinking of you," or "Can't wait to see you tonight." I'd reply with something cheesy, and she'd send back laughing emojis. It was small, but it felt important. A reminder that even when she was busy, I still mattered to her. One evening, as we sat on the couch after another one of her late shifts, she turned to me, her expression serious. "Mark, I know I've been working a lot lately, and I hate how much time it's taken away from us. But I promise, once this project is done, I'll make it up to you." "You don't need to promise me anything," I said. "Just knowing you're trying means the world to me." She smiled softly, resting her head on my shoulder. "You're the best, you know that?" Things were good, better than they'd been in months. But every now and then, a flicker of doubt crept in. Her long hours, her exhaustion. It all seemed genuine. But why did it still feel like there was something she wasn't telling me? That day started like any other. I was at work, powering through spreadsheets and emails, trying to shake off the exhaustion from a late night. Jane had come home even later than usual, apologizing about another long meeting and collapsing into bed without much conversation. I told myself, as I had so many times before, that her workload was just temporary, that things would ease up once the project ended. But the doubts were there, lurking in the back of my mind like an unwelcome guest. Around lunchtime, I glanced at the bouquet of flowers I'd picked up for her earlier that week. They were sitting in the corner of my office, wilting slightly. It hit me how little time we'd spent together lately, how distant things had become despite our recent efforts to reconnect. I decided I'd surprise her at work. Maybe we could grab lunch, even if it was just for 30 minutes. Jane worked at a sleek, modern office building downtown. The kind of place where every desk had a motivational quote and the air smelled faintly of lavender. I'd been there a handful of times for events or to pick her up, but it always felt like a world separate from ours. As I approached the lobby, the receptionist recognized me immediately. "Hey, Mark," she said brightly. "Here to see Jane?" "Yeah," I replied, holding up the coffee and pastry I'd brought along as a peace offering. Figured I'd surprise her. Her smile faltered for a second, so quick I might have missed it if I wasn't watching closely. "Oh, she's been really busy. I'm not sure if she's in her office right now." "That's okay," I said, brushing it off. "If she's not, I'll leave these on her desk." Before she could protest further, I walked toward the elevators. My heart raced, though I couldn't explain why. Something about the way the receptionist hesitated put me on edge. Jane's office was on the 5th floor, tucked away in a quieter section of the building. I stepped out of the elevator and turned the corner, my footsteps echoing faintly in the hallway. As I neared her office, I slowed down, noticing her door wasn't fully closed. And that's when I heard it. Laughter. Her laughter. But it wasn't the light, carefree laugh I knew so well. It was lower, flirtatious. My stomach tightened as I edged closer, peeking through the narrow gap between the door and the frame. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Jane was perched on the edge of her desk, her legs crossed, her body leaning slightly forward. Across from her stood none other than Mr. Biceps, shirtless, of course, his chiseled torso gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His hands rested on either side of her thighs, and the way she was looking at him, my hands trembled, gripping the coffee cup so tightly the lid popped off, spilling some onto the floor. I froze, terrified they'd hear me, but they didn't. They were too wrapped up in each other. "Are you sure no one will come in?" she asked, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. "Relax," he said, smirking. "Your assistant said she's taking her lunch break. We've got time." She giggled, a sound I hadn't heard from her in months. And then, before I could even process it, he leaned in and kissed her. Not a soft, tentative kiss, but a deep, passionate one, his hands sliding up her thighs as she pulled him closer. I wanted to storm in, to yell, to demand answers. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the sheer disbelief, or the gut-wrenching need for proof. Slowly, carefully, I pulled out my phone and hit record, angling it just enough to capture the scene without being seen myself. My heart pounded so loudly I thought they might hear it. "God, you're incredible," he murmured, his lips grazing her neck. She laughed softly, her hands trailing over his shoulders. "You're not so bad yourself." Every word felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into my chest. This was the woman I had loved, the woman I had fought to reconnect with. And here she was, with him, in the very place she'd always described as her sanctuary. I watched as he lifted her slightly, her arms wrapping around his neck, and sat her fully on the desk. Papers scattered to the floor, but neither of them cared. They were too lost in their world to notice anything else. It wasn't until her phone buzzed on the desk that they paused. "That's probably Mark," she said, her tone casual as she glanced at the screen. "Let it ring," he said, leaning in to kiss her again. I had seen enough. My hands were shaking as I stopped the recording and slipped my phone into my pocket. Every instinct screamed at me to confront them, to throw the door open and demand an explanation. But something held me back. Maybe it was the sheer humiliation of the moment, the knowledge that I wasn't ready to hear whatever excuses they might offer. I turned and walked away, my vision blurred with anger and betrayal. My footsteps quickened as I made my way to the elevator, my mind racing with what I'd just witnessed. By the time I reached my car, the gravity of what I'd seen hit me like a freight train. Jane wasn't just distant. She wasn't just stressed. She was betraying me in the most profound way imaginable. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what I was going to do, but one thing was certain. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Nothing would ever be the same again. The drive home felt surreal, like I was trapped in a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as I replayed the scene in Jane's office over and over in my mind. Her laughter, her words, her hands on him. It was seared into my memory, a vivid reminder of just how thoroughly my world had been shattered. But as much as I wanted to explode, to confront her the second she walked through the door, something in me held back. Confrontation would give her a chance to explain, to twist the truth, to somehow make herself the victim. No, I couldn't let that happen. If Jane thought she could betray me and get away with it, she had another thing coming. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the house we'd built together. Felt different now, hollow and unfamiliar. Gathering myself, I walked inside and did what I had to do. I acted like nothing had happened. Later that evening, Jane came home at her usual time. She was smiling, carefree, the same way she always was after her long days at work. "Hey, Han," she said, setting her bag on the counter and leaning in to kiss me on the cheek. It took everything I had not to flinch. "Hey," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "How was work?" She sighed dramatically, running a hand through her hair. "Exhausting, as usual. I swear, this project is going to kill me." I nodded, pretending to listen, while inside, my blood boiled. How effortlessly she lied to my face. "Well, I made dinner," I said, gesturing to the table. "Figured you'd need something after such a long day." Her eyes lit up. "You're the best," she said, kissing me again before sitting down. As we ate, I kept the conversation light, asking about her day, laughing at her jokes. She had no idea I knew. It gave me a strange, bitter satisfaction to keep up the facade while my mind worked furiously on a plan. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the dark living room, the glow of my phone illuminating my face. I rewatched the video I had recorded earlier, my stomach churning with anger and disgust. Every second of it was damning, undeniable proof of her betrayal. But what was I going to do with it? That was the question that kept me awake. Confronting her was inevitable, but it wasn't enough. I didn't just want answers. I wanted justice. The first thing I did was back up the video in multiple places. I uploaded it to a secure cloud storage account, saved it on a flash drive, and even sent it to my own email. There was no way I was losing this evidence. The next step was figuring out how to use it. An idea began to take shape, dark and vengeful. Jane had chosen to humiliate me, to betray me so publicly in her workplace, with someone she knew I despised. If she wanted to play with fire, I'd make sure she got burned. I spent the next few days acting as if nothing had changed. I texted her during the day, greeted her with a smile when she came home, and even suggested we watch a movie together one evening. She didn't suspect a thing. But while I played the role of the oblivious husband, I was laying the groundwork for my plan. First, I created a new email account under a fake name, something untraceable. Then I drafted a message, careful to keep the tone anonymous and professional. The email was addressed to the HR department of Jane's company. It included a simple subject line, concerning employee conduct in the workplace. In the body of the email, I wrote, "I believe you should be aware of inappropriate behavior occurring between two of your employees, documented in the attached video. I trust you'll handle this matter discreetly." I attached the file but didn't send it. Not yet. This was just one part of the plan. Next, I focused on Jane's social circle. She prided herself on her image, the loving wife, the successful career woman, the perfect friend. I knew how much she valued what people thought of her, and that was my leverage. I began compiling a list of mutual friends, family members, and even a few of her close colleagues. When the time was right, they would all receive the same video, along with a short message explaining exactly what Jane had been up to. Finally, I thought about confronting her directly. Part of me wanted to sit her down, show her the video, and watch her squirm as she tried to explain herself. But another part of me, a darker part, wanted to wait, to let her think everything was fine until the hammer came down. The idea of her walking into her office one day, only to find that everyone knew her secret, was almost too satisfying to resist. For now, though, I waited. I continued to gather information, to prepare myself for every possible outcome. I wasn't just going to react to her betrayal, I was going to control it. The next morning, as Jane kissed me goodbye and left for work, I watched her walk out the door, the faintest smile playing on my lips. She had no idea what was coming. It was a quiet Wednesday morning when I finally put the plan into motion. Jane had left for work, kissing me goodbye as she always did, blissfully unaware of what lay ahead. I waited until I was certain she'd be in her office before sitting at my computer. My heart raced as I opened the email I had prepared days earlier, the one with the damning video attached. I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the send button. This wasn't just about exposing Jane's betrayal. It was about delivering a message, about making her feel the weight of what she'd done. With one deep breath, I clicked send, watching as the email disappeared into cyberspace. Within hours, the dominoes began to fall. I started getting texts from mutual friends, some concerned, others outright shocked. "Mark, have you seen this video going around?" One read. "Tell me this isn't true," said another. By lunchtime, the whispers had turned into a full-blown storm. Jane's workplace was buzzing, her colleagues passing the video around like a piece of gossip too juicy to ignore. The HR department didn't take long to act, summoning her into a meeting she couldn't have been prepared for. According to a friend who worked in the same building, the confrontation was brutal. Jane had denied everything at first, but when they played the video, she had no defense. She was suspended on the spot pending further investigation, though the outcome was obvious. But it didn't stop there. Somehow, whether through Jane's coworkers, her social circle, or sheer viral momentum, the video spread far beyond her office. By the end of the day, it had reached friends, acquaintances, and even strangers across town. The small community we lived in was ablaze with rumors and judgment. I kept my phone on silent, but the notifications poured in relentlessly. People I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted to weigh in. Some offered sympathy, but most were focused on Jane. "Can't believe she'd do that to you," one message read. "She deserves everything coming her way," said another. Her social media, once filled with glowing pictures of our life together, turned into a battlefield of comments. People she considered close friends unfollowed her or left scathing remarks. Even her parents, who had always adored her, weren't spared from the fallout. That evening, as Jane walked through the front door, "Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference." I saw it all on her face. The shock, the anger, the humiliation. Her usually flawless appearance was disheveled, her makeup smudged as if she'd been crying. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice trembling. I looked up from my spot on the couch, feigning confusion. "What are you talking about? You know exactly what I mean," she shouted, tears brimming in her eyes. "That video, you sent it to my job, didn't you?" "To everyone." I leaned back, folding my arms. "You mean the video of you in your office? With him? The one that shows exactly who you've been while I've been here, supporting you, trusting you." She stared at me, speechless for the first time. "I didn't make you do any of that, Jane," I continued, my voice calm but laced with venom. "You did this. I just made sure people knew the truth." Her shoulders slumped, and she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "You've ruined my life," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I let out a bitter laugh. "Ruined your life? No, Jane. You did that the moment you decided to betray me. This is just the fallout." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Jane's parents, once proud of their daughter's accomplishments, called me in tears. "What's going on, Mark?" her mother asked, her voice shaky. "We've been hearing awful things." I told them the truth, every detail. Her father was livid, and for once, I saw the man who'd always been hard to please direct his anger at someone other than me. Her mother, meanwhile, could barely contain her sobs. "I don't understand," she kept repeating. "This isn't the Jane I know." Her friends stopped calling. The ones who hadn't already turned against her made it clear they didn't want to be involved. "We can't be associated with this," one of them said when Jane reached out for support. By the end of the week, Jane was a pariah. No one wanted to be seen with her, to take her side, or even acknowledge her. Her social media accounts were deactivated. Her phone calls ignored. She tried reaching out to a few trusted friends, but they either ghosted her or sent curt replies, saying they didn't want to get dragged into the mess. Her parents refused to let her stay with them, claiming it was for their own peace of mind. Even her job, once her pride and joy, was gone. I heard through the grapevine that her employer officially terminated her, citing misconduct detrimental to the company. As for me, I kept my distance. I'd made my move, and now it was time to let her sit in the ruins of her choices. I stayed polite, even cordial when necessary, but I didn't lift a finger to help her. One evening, as she sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale and hollow, she looked at me and said, "I have nothing left, Mark. No job, no friends, no family, nothing." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and said, "Now you know how I felt the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you." Her tears came silently, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, no sadness. Just an overwhelming sense of closure. The house felt different after Jane left. For the first time in years, it was quiet in a way that wasn't oppressive. The absence of her voice, her presence. It wasn't painful anymore. It was liberating. She had packed her things in silence over the course of a weekend. Her face pale, her movements robotic. The few words she spoke were hollow. Apologies that came too late. Questions about where she'd go. Whispers of regret. But I offered no answers, no reassurances. I didn't owe her that. When the front door finally closed behind her, I stood in the middle of the living room and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. This was it, a fresh start. The first thing I did was get rid of everything that reminded me of her. The photos on the wall, the little trinkets we'd picked up on trips, even the scented candles she loved so much. All of it went into a box I left on the curb. My life needed to be my own now, free from the weight of what she'd done. I threw myself into work, pouring my energy into projects I'd neglected during the chaos of the past few months. My colleagues noticed the change. "You seem lighter," one of them said during a meeting. "Like a weight's been lifted." They weren't wrong. I started reconnecting with old friends, people I'd drifted away from during my marriage. At first, it was awkward, explaining what had happened, navigating their shock and pity. But eventually, it became easier. "You're better off," one friend said over beers one night. "You deserve someone who actually values you." Those words stuck with me. I also picked up hobbies I'd long since abandoned. I started running again, rediscovering the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement, the rush of endorphins clearing my mind. I took a woodworking class, building furniture for the house that now felt entirely mine. Each piece I crafted felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd forgotten. Meanwhile, Jane's world continued to crumble. The video had done more damage than even I anticipated. Everywhere she went, people whispered behind her back. Some stared openly, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. Others avoided her altogether, unwilling to associate with someone whose scandal had become the talk of the town. Her parents, once her strongest allies, barely spoke to her anymore. "We're disappointed," her father told me when I ran into him at the grocery store. "We didn't raise her to be like this." I learned through mutual acquaintances that Jane had moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. She couldn't find work. No one wanted to hire someone whose name was synonymous with public humiliation. Even places that didn't know the full story were hesitant, wary of the baggage she carried. Socially, she was a ghost. The friends who once adored her had vanished, unwilling to be tainted by the scandal. Her name came up occasionally in conversations, always in hushed tones. "Did you hear what happened to Jane?" people would ask. The stories varied, exaggerated as gossip often is, but the truth was bad enough. She had ruined her own life. One evening, months after she'd left, I found a letter in the mailbox. The handwriting was unmistakable. Mark, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect a reply. But I need you to know that I regret everything. Losing you, losing us. It's the worst thing that's ever happened to me. I thought I could fix things, but I see now that I can't. You were right, I made my choices and now I have to live with them. I hope you find happiness. I hope you find someone who treats you the way you deserve. Jane. I read the letter twice before folding it neatly and tucking it into a drawer. I didn't need to respond. Her words, while heartfelt, didn't change anything. My life had already moved forward, and I wasn't about to look back. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. I started going on dates, cautiously exploring the idea of love again. It wasn't easy, trusting someone after what I'd been through, but I knew I couldn't let Jane's betrayal define the rest of my life. The town eventually moved on from the scandal, but Jane's reputation remained in ruins. She was a cautionary tale, a name people brought up when discussing the consequences of bad decisions. As for me, I thrived. My career flourished, my friendships deepened, and my sense of self grew stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, as I sat on my newly built patio, watching the sunset, I realized I was truly free. Free from the lies, the betrayal, the pain. My life was my own again, and for the first time in a long time, it felt full of possibilities. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference.